Hello, hello. Today we are going to be talking about autoimmunity.
Yeah. Autoimmunity, it's such a confusing topic. And there's just quite a bit of uncertainty and there's a lot of unknowns with autoimmune disease. So we typically see a lot of these types of processes during our routine check-ins and visits and reveal sessions.
Right. So it's really important to come into this knowing that, I'll back up. So for Christmas this year, we gifted our children lab panels, the comprehensive lab panel that we do for all of our new patients. And they range in ages from 23 to 31, almost 32. And
very healthy, active, involved people.
yeah. And some things came up, and they do often. So you really have to come at a reveal assessment from a perspective of knowledge is power. And I think
Right.
we kind of found that out when we started down this path with them. And, we've also had a lot of patients where autoimmunity has shown up recently. And so that's why we decided that this was a good topic to discuss.
Yeah, I think, man, when I look at the labs that we draw on patients, I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like probably half of everybody that we see has some type of autoimmune finding, whether it be rheumatoid, ANAs, thyroid. I mean, it's just when you start bringing in the general group of people and population, there's a lot of folks that really have a lot of autoimmune issues. They may not even know it. Most don't.
Most don't. Yes, I would say that. And I don't know, that would be a good thing to really look into to get the statistics on. Another thing just to note is that we are not autoimmune specialists
Right.
by any means.
We are not rheumatologists.
However, just like everything else that we're looking for in our assessment, there are things that can be seen early and better handled when you find them early. So that is another piece of the
Right.
puzzle.
So today we kind of hope to give people a little bit of clarity to kind of maybe understand what autoimmune disease really is, which is very confusing and hard to explain, I might even add, but also just kind of give reassurance that this is not the end all problem or a diagnosis or a death certificate. You just need to understand there are practical next steps that you can do to help control or to prevent, autoimmune diseases.
So autoimmune 101.
Right.
Simple definition.
Autoimmunity. It's basically, in a nutshell, it's just an immune dysregulation. That's the best way you can say it. Autoimmune disease. Basically what happens with our immune system when we having a good immune system is important because if we become ill, we get exposed to viruses or bacterial infections. That stimulates our immune system to produce antibodies that go to destroy or to protect us, and so that will help to basically try to destroy that insulting agent that we come in contact with. But when our immune system becomes dysregulated, is the best way you can say it. When it becomes dysregulated, sometimes now it can produce antibodies that see ourselves, our own tissues, as foreign or as invaders. And that's when autoimmune disease starts to develop.
And just to go over a few of the diseases that are included in autoimmune: Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, psoriasis, celiac, MS. Type 1 diabetes is actually an autoimmune disorder, and autoimmune hepatitis. And one new one that I feel like is very new is POTS.
Yeah, postural or orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So that is something we see quite often too. Even symptoms of fibromyalgia can actually be mistaken. A lot of individuals say, well, I got fibromyalgia. I always have achy joints and muscles and things. Well, okay, well, what is that? Is that an inflammatory process? Is it an autoimmune process?
And I think that's a really good segue into what is the difference between inflammation and autoimmunity? Because we look for both of those things.
Right.
But how do they differ?
Yeah. So, obviously the autoimmune disease is where, we're producing the antibodies, which creates an inflammatory response. But it is inflammatory driven related to your autoimmune antibody response. Whereas we can have inflammation not related to allergy or to autoimmune responses. Maybe we don't, for instance, getting a splinter, that creates inflammation. Having problems with certain foods that create inflammation in our gut, that's inflammation. We can drive inflammation higher and start to measure the amount of that inflammation in patients too. So there are biomarkers that can tell us that.
Okay. So why does it feel like autoimmune problems are increasing across the population?
Yeah, it's certainly a really huge question. And I wish I could tell you the answer to that, but we have a lot of theories and thoughts and speculations, but why is it that there's so much autoimmune disease in the population? Is it genetic, or, are there other things that trigger these things? What exposures do we have? Toxins, pollution, our food system, it's just multiple things.
So common contributors to autoimmune issues would be infections, both viral, bacterial, gut permeability and dysbiosis, chronic stress and trauma load, nutrient depletion, mold and toxicity exposures, and then metabolic dysfunction and inflammation.
Right. Yeah, that's quite significant. But as you can see, there's just not one thing you can put your finger on that's causing this autoimmune response, or this new wave of exposures or discovery that folks are having with autoimmune disease. So it's just multifactorial.
And I would say, just in talking with different people, it's not just one thing. It's the total burden on the system.
Right.
That really.
Right. And that's the reason why that there are multiple things and multiple ways that we can help patients to reduce that total burden, to help calm down your inflammatory immune system response. It may not be able to eliminate it, because there's more to it than we understand, but we can at least try to start picking out things that potentially could flare that up.
Yeah. So I think another thing to just mention is that we're seeing autoimmune show up younger and younger.
Yeah, there's not really an age predominance. Of course, when we get into midlife, there's issues there where we do typically see a lot more. But is it because the younger population don't get the labs drawn to find out these things that are potentially going on right now? We've seen that. So there's multiple people in their 20s that are getting labs drawn, that just from a health conscious standpoint, and identifying that, yeah, I've got a problem. I've got to do something about that. But this is also brings up another topic, that knowledge is power. And if you know what's going on, then you can start to help improve the situation to avoid the flare-ups. So hopefully that can delay or offset the chronic disease that can develop.
Yeah. So midlife is potentially just an amplifier of what's been kind of brewing undetected. So hormonal shifts can unmask immune issues. Life stress is often higher in midlife. We're dealing with children, we're dealing with aging patients, all the things that come.
Sleep problems, debt, you name it.
Also, metabolic flexibility often declines in midlife. That can affect the immune system. And then as these things are happening, then it just kind of brings to the surface.
It kind of makes it more visible. Right?
Yeah.
It kind of starts to overwhelm the system, and I start to see the problems.
Yeah. So you use the radio explanation a lot. But so midlife isn't the cause of autoimmunity, but it may be something that turns the volume up.
Turns the volume up. Yeah, exactly. So, but that's the thing is that, the radio's on, that, what we do and what we expose ourselves to can turn up the volume. And so that's what we want to do, is try to minimize that exposure, which can turn down the volume and reduce the symptoms.
So one of the things that has come up a lot recently is a positive ANA with no diagnosis, but definitely having feelings of not feeling normal. So ANA is
Anti-nuclear antibodies. Sorry. I want to explain that. We see it all the time, but not too many people understand.
so a positive ANA is common, and it's not automatically a diagnosis of an autoimmune disease. And I think
Right.
that is something definitely to keep in mind.
It's a screening test.
And so with an ANA, you also get a titer, which is a signal of how strong this anti-nuclear antibody is. And that titer is going to also help you know where you're at and how strong this response is. So an ANA definitely is an alarm that says, hey, something's going on, but we're not sure what.
Yeah. The analogy that we used and heard about, is like the smoke alarm. So ANA is the smoke alarm. And, the titer, which is the concentrations of that ANA, is tells us how loud the alarm is. And then the pattern of that alarm can kind of tell us, okay, where do we look next? What's the story? What symptoms do we have? So now we can start maybe getting some confirmatory labs to look into that a little bit deeper.
Yeah. So one of the most common autoimmune diseases, first, definitely that we see, is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And we've talked about the thyroid before, and we've talked a lot about how you look for that differently than.
Yeah, we got a whole nother podcast on that. It can get quite deep and in depth, but to just kind of scratching their surface. I mean, a person can have normal TSH levels, which are thyroid stimulating hormone levels, which is the routine lab that individuals may get to look at their thyroid function. That's not everything. That's just a scratch of the surface, also. But people can have normal lab values in these areas, and yet still have antibodies now directed towards their thyroid, which is Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
And something that I would just like to mention, because we have had patients with diagnosed Hashimoto's and how they're used to being followed. Typically, once you start thyroid replacement, you're just following the TSH and the free T4. And it's so important to follow that TPO, which is the antibody that diagnoses Hashimoto's. And that number can change depending on what your lifestyle looks like right now. So following that TPO can tell you, like, are the things that I'm doing helping me or not?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah. TPO, or thyroid globulin antibodies also. But, exactly as you put it. And we've seen that. We've seen individuals that we've diagnosed them with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And now when we repeat it, one of those values may back into normal range again. So they're doing something to help offset that volume.
Yeah.
So, but you have to remember that Hashimoto's is the most common cause of autoimmune disease, and is the most common cause of hypothyroidism. And if you're not looking for it, you're not going to find it. So you don't know what you don't know unless you're looking for it.
And then moving on to some of the other examples of autoimmune disease that we talked about, very often these processes start with pretty vague symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
real symptoms, but symptoms that aren't, screaming, hey, look here, this is what you're dealing with. So fatigue, dizziness, palpitations, brain fog, anxiety, temperature intolerance, exercise intolerance.
Yeah.
Those things really could be a lot of different things. As I even kind of read the list, I'm thinking, well, that sounds like perimenopause too.
Right. It can be so confusing.
Right. It can look like so many things.
Right. How many people walk around with dizziness, fatigue, or palpitations and brain fog? So It's a multitude. I mean, there's a lot of reasons and causes for it. So just like headaches, how many different things can cause headaches?
So one of the three pieces of the autoimmune response, the immune system, the autonomic nervous system, and the endocrine system.
Yeah.
Those are.
And when one is dysregulated, the others tend to follow. So that's kind of what happens for folks. It's like a three-legged stool.
Yeah. And that's really why it can be so hard to diagnose, because it's not one system. I mean, we know, as working in the current healthcare system, you have all these different silos where specialists live. And the truth is, this is an area that is inclusive of several of those silos.
All inclusive. Yeah, it's just like, every healthcare provider really needs to understand perimenopause and menopause, or every healthcare provider needs to understand autoimmune diseases and some of their causes and symptoms. But, what do we test? How are we evaluating autoimmunity? How do we identify those things? We start with some basic markers.
Yep. So we've already talked about ANA. Also, we routinely test folks for rheumatoid factor, which is kind of the beginning looking of rheumatoid arthritis.
C-reactive proteins, SED rates.
Yep. And TPO, TG.
Yep.
For the thyroid. So those are the autoimmune markers and the inflammatory markers that we're looking for. Homocysteine might be another one to throw in there for inflammatory marker. And then you have to also look at the supportive nutrients.
Supportive labs, right?
Yes.
That we look at. And those are, of course, vitamin D, iron, B12, and ferritin. And then, of course, the metabolic markers, which is insulin, A1C, and of course, lipids also have an input in this also. So, but, when we also look a little further for evaluating this, we really have to evaluate, well, what is going on in the gut? The gut is a huge component with what I almost believe really is one of the primary components of this. But because of over 70% of our immune system is located in your gut, well, then anything that comes in, we get exposed to. And if your gut is in dysbiosis or dysregulation or not stable, if you will, then that's going to open the door and allow what we call permeability, the inability to keep things out that don't need to come in. So, you think of your door and your house. Well, if you don't have a good weather strip, well, you're going to be leaking air in all the time. And so in order to try to keep that air out, we have to have a good weather stripping. That means having a good gut lining. So,
and there are tests that we can do. We don't do them at the beginning point, but we can add on tests later to look at the gut barrier and see what it looks like. And food sensitivity testing is another piece here that can also be looked at to see, are we causing inflammation without even knowing it? It is very common for people to have a really good, healthy nutrition plan, but in a food sensitivity test, we find out that they're, some of the healthy foods that they're eating are causing inflammation.
Right. Yeah, that is so key. But yeah, you may think you're doing the right thing and eating the right stuff, but it's still causing that dysbiosis, the bloating, the discomfort, the gas, the constipation, the diarrhea, etc. So it all affects your lining.
So what do we do when you've got an autoimmune process going on? What are the treatments? Well, conventionally, steroids, immunosuppressants, biologics are traditionally, those are first line.
Right. Kind of a knee jerk, stops the inflammatory response, kind of makes you feel a lot better quickly.
The cons to that are suppresses the immune system without addressing what's causing the response.
Yeah. And then, of course, you can have side effects from those treatment options, and, it increases your risk sometimes for infections, of course. So, and then there's the root cause support, which is kind of really what needs to happen to get to the bottom of what's really going on. That's where, we look at the food food strategies. What do we have? We need to maybe pare down to get some anti-inflammatory foods in there. Maybe look at what sensitivities are going on. We're having troubles with those. Maybe do some elimination diets to give some testing of that and see, is this really helping?
Gut system support, like, supporting the integrity of the lining of the gut, really digging in there, which then can also lead to ideas of elimination diets and things like that. Stress and nervous system regulation is another piece that is really important.
Yeah. And sleep is so key. We really take we really take for granted what sleep does for the body from a repair and regenerate standpoint. That's certainly something that has to be looked at. What kind of quality of sleep? It's not just getting 8, 9, 10 hours, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours of sleep. I mean, are we getting good quality sleep? So that makes a difference too.
And then along the same lines of stress is our movement and the way we're moving our body. When someone is in an autoimmune flare, that is not the time to go crazy hard with your workouts.
Right.
You need to support yourself and don't stop moving. Continue to move. Just find a different level of intensity that helps you feel better.
Yeah, movement has a way of really modulating and helping to improve our immune system and our response to things like that. So
Nutraceuticals that are good for autoimmune disease, having an optimized vitamin D level.
Keyword is optimized. Almost everybody, if they're not on a supplement of vitamin D, then they're probably not optimized. So it's certainly a key thing. Yeah.
Omega-3, iron, a good methylated B12, probiotics. There are some other things too, but just making sure that your nutrients are optimized.
Supported. Exactly.
And supported. Hormone optimization is another thing. Thyroid, DHEA, and sex hormones, when appropriate, can help to reduce flares and improve quality of life.
Yeah, because if we can optimize our levels like we used to have when we were younger, well, then that's going to give your body a better chance to run smoother. The engine will run smoother. You'll be able to have a quicker, better immune response that maybe won't be dysregulated.
And then some newer things that we are not just learning about, but some newer things that aren't mainstream. They're definitely off-label, but low-dose naltrexone and peptides like thymosin alpha-1.
Yeah, some of those things just don't have the studies, human or randomized studies to look into that stuff yet. So sooner or later, a lot of those things are kind of off-label.
So one thing to note is that very often treatment is going to include bits and pieces out of each of those sections. And there may be some times when, steroids and immune suppression is needed as a bridge to kind of help get you through a flare or,
right.
There is a place for all the treatments.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah. It really just is individualized. It's just so completely individualized for a patient. So
one of the things that we continually hear from patients we find these types of things, or if they're struggling with immune processes, is that it's really hard because the idea is that it's not really curable. So we want to reframe that and say that you can't control the label, but you can control the load. So when you're dealing with autoimmunity, you know that inflammation is what can create the flares and
create the symptoms.
Yeah. So you have so much power and control over the load that you're putting on your system every day.
Yeah. You are totally in control of that. And whatever you're exposing yourself, eating, drinking, etc., that is the load. So, but fewer flares are the important thing. It's not that a person can't correct or reverse their autoimmune disease. It can. We don't understand a lot of it, so we're not really completely, totally sure about that. But we do know that if we can reduce the load, then we can reduce the flare-ups for folks.
And I do, from more of an emotional standpoint, because it's a, when you're dealing with your health, there are a lot of emotions that come up and a lot of feelings of, what did I do wrong? Why is this
Right.
showing up for me? And so working through, you know, the grief of changing your mindset from, you know, what you thought things would look like and how they might look different. And honestly, a lot of the changes that folks with autoimmune diseases have to make revolve around, you know, decreasing the inflammation that you're taking in. So improving nutrition, changing your movement strategy, increasing sleep. And, especially in younger patients, that can feel really hard because
Right.
you have to be a little different than all the people in your peer group because you're protecting yourself.
Right. Maybe it's not going out to the bars, and having the alcohol, and they're avoiding the smoke environments and et cetera, things like that. So
Sure. And that's a hard transition. So, absolutely, having support with counseling is a great way to work through what this looks like.
yeah, absolutely. Whether it be from a mental health specialist or your healthcare provider, either way.
So, if your body is whispering, don't wait for it to be screaming before you start looking into things.
All right.
It
It's a great analogy.
And go into it knowing that knowledge is power and that
Right.
knowing what's going on is going to empower you to do the best thing for your body.
Yeah. And don't blame yourself. Don't beat yourself up over it. It's something that happens. It's unexplainable. But if you know what triggers you have to work on, then you can control that.
So, before doing more, get some clarity. Work with your provider, dig in deep, and find out where you really need to be putting your attention. The gut is a great place to start. Calm the nervous system, replace before you restrict. So, making sure that you have those nutrients optimized, like vitamin D, B12, iron, omega 3s, making sure that those are replaced.
Right.
That always feels better to be adding something in than to be restricting something out. So the more you can do to
Good.
replace, the
But
better.
yeah, and we, backing up a little bit to the gut, we like to really remove a lot of the common inflammatory triggers there too. And we talk about it constantly as more of a GADS elimination diet, where we avoid the gluten, the alcohol, the dairy, and then of course the processed sugars and starches and foods.
And I will just add in a little reframe here that sometimes focusing in adding in the extra protein, the extra fiber that we really need to be optimized can sometimes create that elimination without really feeling like you're restricting yourself.
Right. Right. Kind of a trade-off.
Yes. Another thing you can do is track your patterns. Understand your body. Listen. When you notice that you're not feeling well, think about, what did I eat? What activity? How much sleep have I been getting? When we start to pay attention to the patterns, we can start to connect those dots a little bit easier.
And then of course, reframing this goal is, stability. Stability is key. It's not necessarily trying to cure. That's great if that happens, but the goal is fewer flare-ups or shorter flare-ups, better energy between them, and then confidence that you know what to do when your symptoms show up. And that's where you'll get success. That's where you'll have symptom relief. That's where you'll feel better.
And the last thing is build your team. Find your people who are going to help support you and listen and work through it. There are lots of providers out there who really do have so much to offer and will work alongside you in partnership.
Right. Yeah. It's just a matter of doing your legwork to find the people that will actually help. And, it may take, you may have to create your own community space where you have connections where you can talk, whether it be on Facebook or your church or wherever in your own social environments. But creating those connections can help you kind of identify places where you can go to maybe get some answers.
Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you feel like we missed anything or there's something more you want to dig deeper into, reach out and let us know. We're here for.
Yeah. So have a healthy day.